Thank you. I'd just like to say first that there's a slightly longer version of my talk available outside if anybody would like to purchase it at a small cost. It's just a slightly longer version of this. Okay. The events that occurred in Eastern Anatolia in 1915 should be seen in a broader context than simply that of Turk against Armenian. Both Turks and Armenians were actors in a much wider drama that was unfolding in the world, and any judgment about their actions can only be made with the knowledge that they were caught up in circumstances that were not of their choosing and were largely beyond their control. The context of what happened to the Armenians in 1915 is left out of consideration in most discussions. An event can only be understood in relation to other events in history within the context of cause and effect. If other events are extracted, then historical understanding is impossible. But it seems that this is the objective of people who wish to replace historical understanding with legal argument in deciding about such events. Geoffrey Robertson, QC, wishes for historians to stop discussing the Armenian tragedy altogether. He recently declared in Yerevan that, I quote, "The historians have completed their mission. Now it is the time for judges who will demand proper punishment for guilt and compensation for the genocide victims. It is no longer a subject of historians, but judges," end of quote. And in the New Statesman, Robertson made it clear that the case for him is already closed. And he said, "Genocide is a matter for legal judgment, not a matter for historians. And there is no dispute about the Armenian genocide amongst legal scholars." Robertson is an advocate of international law. At the end of the day, law is policy. It is in effect the foreign policy of the big states of the world. By reducing the event of genocide to law, one is making it into subjective judgment of the big states and a weapon of foreign policy to gain leverage on other states. The nature of an event and whether or not it constitutes genocide is therefore rendered incapable of being measured in any objective way. For this reason, I do not share Robertson's faith in international law. Something that is so partially and consistently applied cannot be taken seriously as having credibility. And if you take this kind of law seriously at all, it is surely debased through its arbitrary application. So I prefer to trust in the historians. What constitutes genocide has become a subjective matter, indeed a matter for policy, about whether it would be in the interests of the dominant states of the world that some event should be termed genocide or not for political advantage. And it has been ruled out as a matter of historical fact or a subject for historical investigation. First of all, let us make no mistake about the single most important event that made what happened in Eastern Anatolia a possibility, the 1907 agreement between England and Russia that prepared the way for the Great War of Destruction on Germany and the Ottoman Empire. For England, the war on Ottoman Turkey, which resulted in the Armenian massacres, came about from a revolutionary change of policy at the start of the 20th century. England had acted as an ally of the Ottoman Empire for most of the century before the Great War, when Britain was determined to preserve the Ottoman state as a giant buffer zone between its Indian Empire and the expanding Russian Empire. It was part of what was known as the Great Game in England, that the Russians shall not have Constantinople and the warm water port and access to the Mediterranean that this would have given them. What completely changed British relations with Ottoman Turkey was the emergence of Germany as a serious commercial rival around the end of the 19th century. Britain had practiced a balance of power policy with regard to with regard to Europe. For centuries, it had built its empire by keeping Europe divided, still it does today to be honest, and by giving military assistance to the lesser powers against any power that might be emerging on the continent. Then, whilst Europe was preoccupied with war, England was able to get on with its business of conquering the rest of the world. It had the great advantage of being an island, and therefore it could meddle with Europe and then retire from the continental battleground and let others continue the fighting when enough had been gained. Britain's chief weapon of war was the Royal Navy, which established and controlled the world market for it. When the continent of Europe was at war, the Royal Navy took over markets established elsewhere by the other European powers, and in this way the British Empire went from strength to strength. During the 19th century, Britain's traditional enemy in Europe had been France, and her traditional rival in Asia was Russia. However, in the early years of the 20th century, England came to the conclusion that Germany was the coming power to be opposed. Therefore, it was decided to overturn the foreign policy of a century and to establish alliances with England's traditional enemies, France and Russia, so that Germany could be encircled. And then when war came about, Britain would join the conflict and destroy Germany as a commercial rival. The alliance that Britain entered into with Russia in 1907, therefore, was the single most important event that made a British war on Ottoman Turkey inevitable. This is where Russia came into the equation. As I have said, Britain was an island nation, and it was primarily a sea power. It did not have a large army, and it had been opposed to military conscription. It would have been impossible for Britain to have defeated Germany by itself. Therefore, it needed the French army and the even larger Russian army to do most of the fighting in Europe for it. The Russian army was particularly important, and it was described in England as a steamroller that would roll all the way to Berlin, crushing German resistance by sheer weight of numbers. The problem for Britain was that the Russians had little real reason to fight Germany. Therefore, something had to be promised to the Tsar for his help in destroying Germany. That something was his heart's desire, Constantinople. That fact should always be borne in mind when people suggest that Turkey brought the war on itself. The fact of the matter was that in order to defeat Germany, Britain had to promise Constantinople to Russia. And in order for the Russians to get Constantinople, there had to be a war on Turkey. Britain prepared for war on the Ottoman Empire nearly a decade before it occurred. Maurice Hankey conducted extensive spying operations on behalf of Royal Naval Intelligence in the summer of 1907, based on the contingency that Britain would soon be at war with the Turks. Hankey and his colleagues scrutinized the harbors and naval defenses of the Ottoman Empire. He surveyed in particular the coastal defenses of the Dardanelles and an amphibious landing at Gallipoli in mind to follow up a report of the Committee of Imperial Defense, produced in December 1906. And it was Hankey, as Secretary of the CID, who first proposed to the British War Cabinet in December 1914 that the plans made in 1906 should be put into operation. The alliance with Russia was obviously the main factor that spelled trouble for the Ottoman Empire, but it was not the only factor that encouraged Britain to overturn her traditional foreign policy. Britain began to show an increasingly aggressive attitude in relation to the Ottomans as Germany showed interest in the Ottoman Empire. What worried Britain about the German involvement with the Ottoman Empire was that it was not the parasitic relationship of the other imperialist powers. The German objective seems to have been to rejuvenate and modernize the Ottoman Empire, partly through the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, in exchange for commercial rights there. England and Russia had seen the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, and they had been waiting around for his death, but now they looked on as Germany threatened to revive the sick man and dash their dreams of conquest. This great reorientation of British foreign policy had serious consequences for not only the Ottoman Turks, but also for the Armenians. Prior to 1907, it was the Russians alone who wished to exploit the Armenians for political ends, and the Armenians always had to consider the likelihood that if they rose in revolt, Britain would restrain the Russians from taking advantage of the situation, and any uprising would be crushed without foreign help. The Russians complained that they were stopped in assisting the Armenians because of the Cyprus Convention of 1878 between Britain and the Ottoman Sultan. This guaranteed a British war on Russia if the Tsar moved into Ottoman territory in return for Cyprus being occupied by Britain. But this all changed in 1907. Under the Anglo-Russian Treaty, England and Russia agreed to an immediate partition of Persia between them and envisaged a future partition of the Ottoman Empire in which the eastern provinces would go to Russia and Mesopotamia would go to Great Britain. Later, once Russia had shown its commitment to the war on Germany in the secret Constantinople Agreement of March 1915, the Ottoman capital, which the British described as the greatest prize of the war, was awarded formally to the Tsar. Russian annexation of the eastern Ottoman provinces became the common program of Great Britain and Russia alike. The fact must be emphasized that there has never been any Russian population in these provinces, and the Armenians constituted Russia's only ground for intervention and eventual annexation. The pre-war Armenian revolts illustrate this point very well. In 1894-96, Armenian nationalists believed they had got signals that the intervention of the great powers would take place if they could provoke the Ottomans into a harsh reaction. They attempted this, but found that Britain had not changed its position at this point, and Russia therefore could not act. In 1909, in Adana, there were raised expectations of foreign intervention amongst Armenian groups. However, Britain needed the preservation of the Ottoman Empire until Russia was prepared to advance against Germany in a European war. The result was disaster for the Armenians after they had initiated killings in the hope of foreign intervention, only to be left to face the consequences of their actions from their neighbours alone. By 1914-15, England was in alliance with the Tsar, and all restraint was removed from Russia and the Armenian nationalists. Mayhem, mutual killings were instigated in the Ottoman Empire by the Entente powers to bring about its collapse and to facilitate the absorption of its parts into the empires of Britain, France, Russia, and others. In a general war situation which threatened the very existence of the state in which the Armenians lived and which forced them to choose between it and their deliverance by the great powers, catastrophe for either them or for local Muslims was always going to be the most likely outcome. As I have said, the context is all important. The Entente powers had every interest in stirring up Armenian rebellion to further their war effort, while the Ottomans had every interest in preserving good relations with the Armenians. Intention is a very important element in judging the nature of an event. The Ottomans had no objective interest in creating an Armenian genocide. Their interest lay in maintaining the Armenians as a loyal and functional community within the Ottoman state. And the CUP would undoubtedly have preferred it if the Armenians had remained that way. The breakdown in Ottoman state infrastructure and authority caused by the British blockade and by the invading Allied armies was the major factor in turning the position of Armenians and other Christian groups from being mainstays of the commercial infrastructure of the Ottoman Empire and the loyal community into a problematic element within it. And since the objective of the Allies was the destruction of the commercial life of the Ottoman state through invasion and blockade, what future indeed had the Armenians in it? Lately, I came across a speech by T.P. O'Connor made in the House of Commons during the debate on the Treaty of Lausanne. O'Connor was one of the last remaining Irish MPs left in the British Parliament after the Irish Parliamentary Party had been smashed by Sinn Féin in the 1918 general election. He made an impassioned plea on behalf of the establishment of an Armenian state in Anatolia, which he said had been abandoned in the treaty signed by the British Empire with the resurgent Turks. The bulk of O'Connor's speech is taken up with quotations expressing British support for the Armenians during the war and detailing the betrayal of the Armenians by the Entente after it. O'Connor also credits the Armenians with having played a vital role in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, despite attempts by the Turks to gain their loyalty. O'Connor said that whilst the Ottomans attempted to retain the loyalty and service of the Armenians with concessions, the Entente powers sought to use them in their destruction of the Ottoman state. And when the Armenians were no longer useful and Ataturk had established Turkey as a power to be reckoned with, the Entente just left them high and dry. The Armenians, like other peoples in strategically important areas during 1914-18, found themselves used as pawns in a new great game. After being encouraged to insurgency, they were quickly discarded and forgotten when their interests no longer coincided with those of their great power sponsors. The Armenian nationalists relied upon external forces as the only means of creating an Armenian state within Ottoman territories. This was because they were a relatively small minority in Eastern Anatolia, constituting only about 1 in 6 of the population of the Ottoman lands they claimed. Only through outside help from a great power and extensive ethnic cleansing of their Muslim neighbours could they achieve their nationalist objective. The two main uses that Britain had for the Armenians were, firstly, to encourage American participation in the war, and secondly, to cultivate and construct a case against the Ottomans in order to justify the incorporation of Muslim lands into the British Empire after the war. These were the primary interests of Britain in them, and not their well-being. That can be seen in the way Britain failed to press the Armenian case after they had acquired Mesopotamia and Palestine, and how they put the Blue Book back on the shelf for use on another day. After the Great War, Britain had it in her power to bring about an Armenian state, and to try those who were accused and detained in connection with the deaths of Armenians. But despite attempting many things in the world that were immensely more difficult at the time, it decided not to follow through with these two measures, as if it did not take the claims it made against the Turks as seriously as it pretended to during the war. The Armenians did not possess land or resources required by the Ottoman Turks for any colonial program. The major area in which they lived was mainly of interest to the Ottomans because it contained substantial numbers of Turkish and Kurdish Muslims. This can be compared with cases in other places in the world where natives were in possession of territory where Britain and other imperial powers required for their empires. I'm thinking of North America and Australia in particular. The policy of extermination of inferior races that Britain carried out in the name of progress was openly proclaimed by Charles Dilke and many other imperialist writers in the 19th century. Dilke stated frankly and proudly in his immensely popular book, Great Britain, that the Anglo-Saxon race was the most effective genocidal force in world history. And this is what he said: a gradual extinction of the inferior races is not only a law of nature, but a blessing to mankind. The Anglo-Saxon is the only extirpating race on earth. The word extirpation is a much stronger word than the word genocide. Extirpation means the intentional, planned, total and utter destruction of a race. Genocide, according to Article 2 of the 1948 Convention, is a much wider legal concept under which practically all of the European nations could be charged for their activities between 1914 and 46, when various peoples settled accounts with each other and vast amounts of ethnic cleansing and killing were done in Europe. In effect, the word genocide has meant the partial destruction of a people, since extirpated people no longer exist to commemorate their destruction. Nothing like the extirpation practiced by European colonialism is applicable to the Ottoman state in relation to the Armenians or any other minority within the territory of their empire. In fact, the Ottomans were criticized by British writers for their easygoing tolerance of races, which it was suggested was leading to the demise of their empire. The British social Darwinists were in particular appalled at the way the Ottomans had intermarried and incorporated other races into the governing of their empire, and had blended aspects of their cultures into the Ottoman mix. In those days of empire, the British believed in a distinct racial hierarchy and saw race mixing as an abomination and fatal to their racial stock. The British and Ottoman empires had entirely different notions of race and governing. It was argued that the British Empire was successful because it was founded on the principle of racial and religious distinction and hierarchy, whereas the Ottomans played fast and loose with these to the extent, in the English biological view, that they contravened the laws of nature, leading to an inevitable Ottoman extinction. Such ideas that were prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon notion of progress would have been seen as inexplicable to the Ottoman Turk. The point I am making is that if there was a racially genocidal spirit at hand in 1915, it was to be found on the opposing side to the Turks, amongst the Anglo-Saxons, who had obliterated races across the world in the name of progress and civilization, and the creation of new great white settler nations in the continents of America and Australasia. Hitler may or may not have uttered the notorious question, who remembers the Armenians? But the Armenians are remembered today to a much greater degree than the many races that perished as a result of imperialist expansion across the globe. These races are now footnotes in history, while the Armenians have had hundreds of books dedicated to them. It was not those who killed the Armenians who inspired Hitler. The race he admired most and who he tried to emulate in the world was the Anglo-Saxon. The evidence for this is laid out most comprehensively in a book by the Armenian-born Manuel Sarkisyan entitled Hitler's English Inspirers. After the war, when Ataturk had triumphed over the British, he was very generous to the enemy. But let's speak plainly here. Those who came to Gallipoli were representatives of the great genocidal nations of the world. The Turks surely would have seen what these extirpating nations had done across the world to native peoples they had conquered, and could have expected the same to be done to them. Those who invaded from the east had been responsible for the clearing of more than 1 million Caucasian Muslims within living memory, and I have read many British accounts from the period that speculated about what would happen if the Turks disappeared without any concern for what would happen to the inhabitants of the state in such an event. So who knows what might have happened to the Turks if the Tsarist state had not collapsed in 1917 and Ataturk had not defeated the British and their allies. The use of the word genocide with regard to what happened to the Armenians during the Great War is an attempt to connect Turkey with Nazi Germany and what it did to the Jews. However, a much better analogy would be what happened on the Eastern Front between the Second World War, when different groups of people became destabilized by the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Here, terrible things were done as state authority began to collapse. Society began to return to the elements, and people struggled for mere survival in the circumstances. We can see that today in Syria. In 1915, the Russian and British invasions of the Ottoman Empire had a similar effect. The invasions raised expectations so that some were willing to kill people they had grievances against, and in turn these people exacted revenge on them. No one quite knew under whose authority they would exist when the war was over, and therefore all restraint was removed on behavior. It was under these circumstances and in this context that the relocation of Armenians took place and the mass killings of both Christian and Muslim peoples. The problem of nationalism. Attributing intention as opposed to discovering actual intention seems to take a large part in deciding what constitutes a genocide these days, and this seems to count more than actual deeds in determining what is genocide. The cultivation of nationalism was a British liberal tactic used to break up multinational empires of rival powers in the 19th century. It worked by sowing the seeds and cultivating the harvest of nationalism in them, whilst denying and repressing it closer to home. In this way, Britain sought to undermine states it saw as rivals by destabilizing them through their national minorities, whilst doing everything to repress and subdue minorities within their own empire, of course, as they did in Ireland. The clearance of Armenians from Eastern Anatolia should have been seen from the British perspective as progressive, since it was the culmination of the general process that England encouraged in regard to the Ottoman territories and elsewhere in the world. The responsibility for what happened to the Armenians and the other minorities that existed relatively peacefully within the Ottoman Empire for centuries must be placed, therefore, primarily at the hands of those who attempted to destabilize and ultimately destroy the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire. The importation of nationalism into the Ottoman Empire for the purposes of weakening it and gaining leverages for the great powers is very much at the root of what happened to the Armenians. Nationalism was a most unsuitable thing to promote in the region covered by the Ottoman Empire, where a great patchwork of peoples were intermingled and interdependent. Its promotion in the region by the Entente powers was as disastrous for the many Muslim communities of the Balkans and the Caucasus who were driven from their homes of centuries, as it was for Christians caught up in the inevitable consequences of the simplifying process it encouraged. The Ottoman Empire had been a tolerant, multi-ethnic empire for hundreds of years, in which different races and religions had lived side by side in peace and harmony. For instance, alone out of all the states in Europe at the time, the Ottomans accepted the entry and settlement of Jewish refugees fleeing from persecution so that these people could contribute their talents to the empire. As a result, the Ottoman Empire became the most successful example of collaboration in history. From the 14th to the 19th centuries, peoples of diverse races, religions intermingled contentedly and successfully under Ottoman administrations, and even the Balkans became a relatively peaceful area. If there was antagonism between Christian and Muslim in the region, it was primarily the result of the Russian imperial expansionism of the previous 3 centuries, which had seen Tartars, Circassians, and Abkhasians driven from their lands into the Ottoman territories. Armenians took the place of Muslims in the Yerevan Khanate in what is modern Armenia. During the 19th century, the vast ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the Caucasus by Russia and in the Balkan Wars by the emerging Christian nations set off a wave of inter-ethnic violence and population movements that set a pattern for the history of these regions during the 20th century. Raphael Lemkin, who Geoffrey Robertson describes as the legal architect of the UN Genocide Convention, interestingly attempted to categorize the phases of genocide. And he said, genocide has 2 phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. The Ottomans never attempted anything like this in relation to the subject races of the empire. The millet system did not even encourage assimilation and provided for the maximum expression of every community's national pattern. If the Balkan Wars had one great effect on the Ottoman Empire and its Muslim inhabitants, it was to begin to shatter the long-held faith in multi-ethnic communities existing together in mutual benefit that had characterized the empire for centuries. And the influx of large numbers of Muslim refugees among the Christian communities within the Ottoman Empire must have had consequences for the maintenance of public order as soon as Anatolia itself was threatened by the Western powers and state authority removed. They would have feared the worst for themselves and their families and been determined it would not happen again. We know that some deputies in Istanbul called for a clean break with the empire's past and advocated a withdrawal from territories that were not predominantly Turkish and a future reliance on the Muslim people of the Anatolian heartland as a basis of the nation. Such sentiments began to be expressed in publications that took the Western view that the Ottoman Empire, not being based on national principles, would collapse like a house of cards. This development is sometimes called Turkification by those wishing to attach the label of genocide of what happened in Eastern Anatolia. In the course of thinking about this issue, I read that QC Geoffrey Robinson's opinion, was there an Armenian genocide? Robinson knows that intent is very important in legal matters and tries to suggest that the Young Turks, and I quote, developed a kind of race supremacy theories that are particularly associated with the build-up to genocide. For example, the racist idea that Turanian nationality was a badge of superiority, public subhumanizing of minority groups, extreme nationalist fervor, demanding a warrior nation to prevent the decay of the Turkish race. Robertson is more accurately describing the characteristics and ideology of British imperialism than he is the attitudes of the Ottomans to the peoples they governed. He presents no evidence of a significant racialist body of writings that inspired and justified a program of genocide like that of the English social Darwinists. It is also clear that the Ottoman Empire did not actively pursue a policy of religious homogeneity in 1915. Events from then to 1923 certainly resulted in the heterogeneous Ottoman state giving way to the largely homogeneous Turkish Republic, but this was due to the circumstances imposed on it more than anything else. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing under the weight of problems that came to it from Europe, and the CUP looked for solutions to its predicament in that direction too. It had been a multi-ethnic state based on a healthy disregard for any notions of racial hierarchy. But what was being imposed upon it from the West in the name of progress was the requirement that society should be based on the nation state rather than on a multi-ethnic religious combination with as much racial homogeneity as possible. If some Ottomans began to lose faith in the character of their empire, this was a consequence of a process instigated by liberal Britain and Tsarist Russia in order to destabilize the Ottoman Empire. If a small minority of writers succumbed to British social Darwinist ideas of progress, then they were not merely coming up to the benchmark set and propagated successfully by British imperialism. However, the continuation of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire did not require a genocidal policy on the part of the Ottomans, but the establishment of a nationalist Armenian state in Anatolia did. This was because, unlike the Greeks and Bulgarians in the old Balkan provinces, who possessed majorities and many of the elements of nationhood, in none of the eastern provinces did the Armenians constitute a majority of the population. So whilst it was comparatively easy for Greeks, Bulgarians, once Western ideas of nationalism had reached them, to enlarge the autonomy of their own community into territorial independence, any attempt to transfer Armenian autonomy from a religious to a territorial basis was quite another matter. The population of the modern eastern provinces was such that a restoration of the old Armenian kingdom was impossible without overcoming 6 centuries of history through the construction of a homogeneous Armenian state. That would have, of necessity, have involved ethnic cleansing of large numbers of Turks and Kurds, and almost certainly have required a policy of genocide against them to achieve a stable Armenia. In the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the area claimed for an Armenian state was gigantic and included territory as far west as Sivas and Adana. The Ottoman state was an established functional entity built upon peace and stability of 6 centuries, whereas an Armenian state in the region would have been a violent revolutionary affair. These types of constructions are rarely good for any minorities that might find them obstructing the necessary process of nation buildings. Turks, Kurds, Jews, other Armenian groups in the new state would have more than likely been exterminated or driven out. The question of intention is also relevant. There are instances in which population movements involving slaughter were planned and done intentionally. For instance, the area bombing of Germany during World War II by the RAF had the intention of killing the German workforce. It was planned, refined, with the intention of maximizing working class casualties within dense population areas. There were also huge population movements conducted by the British in Malaya and Kenya during uprisings, about which as little has been known since till lately. It is not at all a convincing argument to suggest that the Ottomans had any intention or plan to wipe out the Armenians. There was a complete absence of such an ideal in Ottoman literature, and the appliance of basic historical principle of cause and effect suggests that the relocations were a practical response to an emergency situation, however badly they might have been handled. In the spring of 1915, 3 events precipitated and provoked the Armenian relocations: the Gallipoli landings by the British, a large ambush in Zeytin by Armenian insurgents, and the Armenian rebellion in Van, which resulted in a massacre of Muslims. In April, Lord Bryce and the Friends of Armenia in London made a widely publicised appeal for funds to equip Armenian volunteers fighting behind Turkish lines. Any state will protect itself if attacked, And these three events, which took place right across Ottoman Turkey, with the Russians on the advance into Anatolia, placed the state on an emergency footing of the highest order. Population movement was the primary defensive measure taken by the Ottoman state in relation to these events and the position of the Armenians. And most of the deaths occurred incidentally to this emergency measure. The Russian reform program of 1913-14 had left little doubt in Istanbul that Russia aimed to annex Turkey's 6 eastern provinces, over which she had declared a propriety interest. And that was the usual preliminary to an imperial power declaring a formal protectorate and annexing a region. Before the declarations of war on the Ottoman Empire, the Russians had begun arming the Armenians in preparation for invasion. The Russian armies brought with them Armenian groups armed with allied weapons whose main purpose was to kill Turks and Kurds, which they proceeded to do. British and Russian agents circulated amongst the Armenians behind the Turkish lines and provided them with weapons and money to enable them to create general disorder. In the Armenian capture of Van and the general massacre of Muslims that followed, Ottoman soldiers were diverted and prevented from reaching the front to fight the invaders. All these factors influenced the Ottomans to relocate the Armenian population. Along with the Armenian relocation, there was also a relocation of up to 800,000 Muslims from the war zone. When the Ottoman authorities moved various peoples out of the war zones, they became prey to other groups with scores to settle. Muslim civilians faced similar problems as they fled the attacking Russian armies, only to be harassed by armed Armenian bands. I've seen figures of up to 500,000 Muslims killed, with extensive lists of names and modes of death recorded by the authorities. Even before 1915, Eastern Anatolia resembled a powder keg. The Kurdish tribes were well armed, virtually sovereign in the areas they roamed. They and the Christian townsmen bought arms from the Russians, and frequent skirmishes occurred between different groups. The Russians flirted with using the Kurds, as well as the Armenians, as instigators of chaos in the region prior to the war. Order was only maintained by the Ottoman presence between the various elements. If that presence was removed, as it inevitably would in wartime, it was predictable as to what would occur. Relocations were the standard military response to guerrilla warfare waged behind the lines at the time. A decade and a half before the Turks relocated the Armenians, the British relocated Boer and African civilians away from the war zone in the Transvaal into concentration camps. This was not a defensive act conducted in response to encirclement, invasion and rebellion, as was the case in Anatolia in 1915, but it was done in the course of an aggressive expansion aimed at neutralizing a population that was resisting conquest. The United States also conducted relocations with regard to the Native Americans, putting them into reservations, and this was after multiple genocides were carried out over centuries on the American continent. Britain conducted its relocations and confinements in stable conditions, controlling the seas around Africa under no pressure of blockade, with plentiful availability of food supplies in a localized conflict fought in a gentlemanly way by their opponents. And yet they still managed to kill tens of thousands of Boer and African women and children in the process. It was called methods of barbarism at the time, but I've never seen it called genocide. The Armenians were not imprisoned by the Ottomans, but resettled away from the war zone. It was probable the majority survived the forced migration into Syria, and Armenians away from the war zone in Istanbul, Izmir and Edirne were largely left alone. Therefore, the character of the Ottoman actions suggests that it was more of a defensive emergency war measure than an aggressive extirpating campaign practiced by imperial powers. The difference between what the British did in South Africa and what the Ottomans attempted to do in Eastern Anatolia was that the Ottomans were confronted by a much stronger enemy, an assault on their state. The Armenian relocations were conducted in a situation of external invasion, blockade, starvation, inter-community killing, and the general lawlessness of a collapsing state apparatus. Professor Zizek's book, The Great War and the Forced Migration of Armenians, shows the Ottomans did not have the intention of destroying the Armenian population in the course of moving them out. he shows that there were attempts to care for them in various ways. The decree of locations issued by the Ottoman government insisted that those who were moved should be cared for, protected, and adequately fed, and preparations were made to this effect. However, the war conditions imposed on the region by the Entente invasions and blockade ensured that such conditions could be adequately met. Okay, I'm just coming to the end now. The British blockade of the Ottoman Empire, which began even before the formal declaration of war, was carried out with the intention of starving Ottoman citizens to force them into surrender and encouraging a general collapse of Ottoman society into anarchy. A similar blockade was organised against neutral Greece to encourage regime change and her enlistment in the Allied ranks. It has been argued that it was the neglect and incompetence of the Ottoman authorities that were responsible for such high levels of deaths amongst its own soldiers. However, it must be remembered that Germany suffered nearly 1 million deaths from the starvation blockade organised against it by the Royal Navy. Germany was a highly organised society with great skills of improvisation that helped it to hold out against blockade for 4 years. However, it too failed and was ground down by the irresistible force of the Royal Navy. This is the conclusion. The logical implication of all this is that if what happened to the Armenians in 1915 is to be described as genocide, we must look much wider for those responsible than just within the CUP and Ottoman authorities directly responsible for relocating the Armenians. If the deaths of Armenians are seen as genocide, the powers that were most responsible for it were Britain and Russia, and to a lesser extent France. In the interests of destroying Germany and conquering the Ottoman territories, they made the Ottoman state an impossible place for Armenians to live in the space of a few months, after they had lived in it peacefully for centuries. If we are to talk of an Armenian genocide and insist on an official apology, we must put these countries in the dock first, because without their actions, it would never have happened. Thank you.
Good success.